So once again, a very warm welcome, Professor John Ryan, and what a pleasure to have you. And it's been quite some time that we have been interacting with each other across obviously so far online platforms, but across diverse projects. And finally, it's an absolute pleasure to have you, and most importantly, in a space like Adda, Roots and Roots, where we usually always make the best of our efforts. That on the one side, we try to ensure that we have the conversation as easily, as openly as possible, and also on the other side, obviously, without at all compromising with the intellectual diversity of the space. So once again, a very warm welcome, Prof.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's a great theme, and Roots, of course, is so very closely connected to plant studies. And we may have a chance to speak more about that, the ways in which plants are both rooted but also mobile, and also the ways that plants have been translocated and relocated over hundreds and hundreds of years, and even to this day in digital form. And so, yeah, very happy to join you this evening.
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously, I wish to right away start the conversation because it's actually such a fascinating, and personally for me, and I believe for a lot of people like us, like Gautam, I can already see him here, and a lot of others who have joined this conversation today will be surely quite interesting. But prior to that, I would like to briefly introduce Prof. Although he's quite a well-known figure in the field of widely, if I put it, as the field of environment and ecology, obviously with a lot of cross sections and intersections, I must acknowledge. He is a professor. He's an international researcher. He's a creative writer in the field of environmental humanities, and he's an associate professor and an adjunct senior research fellow at the Nlungu Research Institute, University of Notre Dame in Australia. And he has published a wonderful array of academic books, refereed journal articles, conference publications, being co-organizers as keynote speakers. He is also the chief editor of the journal Plant Perspectives and the managing co-editor of the Trumpeter. And obviously, there is a lot of more to say about Prof. But obviously, I don't want to steal away all the time in the introduction, and I'm very excited, like all of us, to have a conversation. But if you wish to know more about Prof, please get into his website, www.john, John, Charles, Charles, Ryan, Ryan.com, all in short letters, www.johncharlesryan.com. And I'm sure you will be finding so many diverse things out there. Now, maybe, Professor, if we can start off with a very fundamental question, a question I'm sure each one of us would actually like to hear from you. There has already been so much of conversations going on about the question of intersections of different living forms with the human forms, about the question of assemblage that Professor Donna Haraway has already talked about in Toulouse, about the questions of post-human studies. We are already doing a lot around post-humanities. We are talking about plant humanities. We can see somebody like Shumana Roy working a lot on that. We have something like, plastic studies and environment and its intersections in literature. We have waste Eocene. So many essential perspectives are coming to the forefront, and they're all very important. They're all extremely important. We have now fungi studies and mushroom studies, and so many different essential aspects are taking place. And what, as an individual, I see, and I see it as an important turn, as an essential turn in our intellectual perceptions about the society which is around us, which is mostly by default a very anthropocentric approach, in those situations and conditions, the focus gradually is now going more and more towards this very individual, delicate components rather than being generalized as being environmental, as being sustainable. And I think something like human plant studies will is a very important addition to that already building scholarship. So maybe Professor John, if you can slightly enlighten us about how, like, what is human plant studies, and also how do you distinguish, or where do you see the distinctions and the overlaps of human plant studies with the existing paradigms of literature around environment that we have so far?
Yes, yes, great question. The way that I see plant humanities being positioned is in relation to the environmental humanities. And so you might think of certain evolutions of the environmental humanities over the last 15 years. We've had, for example, zoo criticism, which is sort of an animal focused eco criticism coming out of post colonial critique and post-colonial literary studies. We've had the blue humanities evolve as a kind of marine or hydrological emphasis within the environmental humanities. And so there have been these trajectories, uh, I would say, within the environmental humanities rather than apart from the environmental humanities, because I see something like plant studies and its cognate areas as still very much connected to the ethos, to the methodologies, to the theoretical positions of the environmental humanities. But having said that, even in my own thinking about human plant studies, there is some confusion, right? So we have lots of comparable areas that have cropped up. I often have this question in mind, and it's often one posed to me as well by others, is what is the difference between critical plant studies, human plant studies, interdisciplinary plant studies, right? So the field is evolving in a way that it's, I think, time to kind of clarify its position. And so what I mean by human plant studies is a framework based in cultural studies and to some extent environmental sociology that is, first of all, interdisciplinary, and that provides a kind of broad framework for thinking through, especially ethical issues related to plants and human plant interactions. So, since about the 1990s, or perhaps even a little earlier, we've had human animal studies, and it's had a great kind of fluorescence. It's so well established that, in fact, it's taught at some veterinary uh, colleges in the United States and elsewhere. And so human animal studies has really taken hold. And within the study of human and animal interactions, there's a strong emphasis on ethics. So what are the ethics of involving animals in experiments of various kinds? What are the ethics of eating animals, the ethics of not eating animals, the ethics of animals as pets, as wild animals, as invasive species, right? These are all the kinds of issues that fall under human animal studies. And so the actual term human plant studies was proposed by Giovanni Alloy in an article in his journal, the journal that he publishes, which is, it will come to me in a moment, Antenna. And it's about 2010, I would say, or perhaps a little earlier. And I was reading this article. It's a kind of off comment that he makes, or a side comment about the possibility for human plant studies. And so I took his postulation and theorized the idea of human plant studies as a, if we could say, uh, a vegetal incarnation of human animal studies, such that it provides that broad framework for considering, especially considering issues of ethics. Now, say within a cultural, I see human plant studies as very much informed by cultural studies, cultural theory, eco-sociology. And so within that, you can have methods like ethnographic approaches to learning about plants. You can also, it also provides a space for advancing new methods of ethnography where plants can actually be subjects of inquiry or participants in research. Okay, so that's human plant studies in a nutshell. But then we have these other curious areas like the plant humanities, which is a term proposed only 7 years ago by scholars at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., Plant Humanities Research Center. And so we have plant humanities, and that's really evolved out of archival work, the work of historians, uh, looking to the archives of various kinds, and also herbaria and botanical collections of various kinds to advance our understanding about plants in a disciplinary way. So that's been another evolution, which is closely connected to human plant studies. Then a lot of us are already familiar with critical plant studies, and that really is Michael Marder's area. That's a term that he proposed. And it's coming very much out of Western continental philosophy. And in a nutshell, it's really about reevaluating the role of plants in Western philosophy and giving them their due prominence as not merely backgrounds to philosophical inquiry, but as having contributed a great extent to the thinking of major Western philosophers. And so those are a few areas. They are interconnected. Let's say we have critical plant studies, about a 15-year provenance. We have human plant studies, also about 15. We have plant humanities, about 7 years. Each one has its orientation or even interdisciplinary orientation. One has its own places of origin, its own major figures, but they really do overlap. But I would say one way of thinking about this is through the idea of the plant turn, right? A turn towards plant, much as there have been many other turns over the years in critical theory. You can talk about a plant turn, which has been very much fueled by the urgencies of ecology, of the Anthropocene, of the loss of plant species, loss of plant diversity, and also the loss of cultural traditions linked to plant diversity. So yes, that's the way that I would map out human plant studies as it sits in relation to cognate areas.
Thank you so much, Prof. And I deeply appreciate the elaborative reflection that you shared about human plant studies and how it is, I mean, the various convergences and the divergences with the various existing other forms of disciplines that widely engages with the question of the relationship between humans and plants and animals and other forms, other life forms in this planet Earth. Two things. I mean, obviously, it was a very generous and reflective response, but two things really stood out for me, and I really want to further explore your thoughts on that. And one is the question of ethics and the ethnography. And obviously, I must admit that why these two perspectives really stood out for me because. Someone like me who has been working on the question of environment, but widely trying to focus on the question of methodology and methodology in the sense that when we are asking these basic questions or when we are sharing these basic statements that we have to protect the natural environment. It is our human responsibility to protect the natural environment. But there is also a simultaneous side in me that immediately questions me that who exactly I am as a human being to protect the natural environment. Isn't the natural environment has the capability to protect itself on its own? Who has given me the right as a human being, a community who has been for ages and histories responsible for systemically destroying the natural environment, now talks about protection. And also there is, and this is something, a question which I keep on, fighting within me. This sort of question keeps on fighting within me. And along with that, another question that also keeps on bothering me is when I'm talking about, and usually with a lot of my personal, physical, and emotional interaction with plants and animals and insects and birds, and the smell of the nature and the sounds of the nature and the other forms of nature, I always feel that this is a very deep down, I always acknowledge a deep down emotional connection that I feel closely with the nature, and how the nature is so powerful in teaching us with its sounds and colors and images and a lot of its impression. But at the same time, whenever I engage with this thought of ethnography with nature, I slightly become worried about my own self, where I should stop, where I shouldn't cross the boundary, or to what extent I am capable of interacting with nature. Most importantly, how should I interact with the nature by checking my privileges as a human being and ensuring that in the process of that, uh, the ethics of nature, the ethics of natural environment doesn't get violated. I know this is like a very vast and expansive question, but I'm just loudly thought sharing with all of us. Maybe, Prof, because you talked about the question of the interactions of the humans and animals, and these are such important questions that if I am an animal lover, still is it ethical to consume animal meat? But then it can have multiple responses, especially, recently I was reading this fantastic work by uh, Liena Betasamusakis Simpson, As We Have Always Done. And there she talks about, from the Nishnabeg philosophical perspective, that how their consumption of the deer meat is a spiritual process. And they have this entire Nishnabeg philosophy that justifies how the deer clan itself sacrifices one of its deer for the welfare of the humans. And that is how they feel a sort of a spiritual, a cultural, a ritualistic interaction. It is not just about random killing or game hunting or trophy hunting and consuming that or displaying that in the museums, right? So these ethical questions, they are essential, but they're complicated and confusing. So maybe, if Professor, how do you deal with these questions on your side, if you can throw some light on these?
Mhm. Yes, yes. So some of the questions we might ask in relation to the ethics of plants are, um, is it okay? I'll give you an example. There is a plant known as an Arabidopsis. It's like the white rat of the botanical plant science experimental realm. It's the go-to plant if you're looking to experiment of various kinds of experimental work on plants. Uh, there's a high chance you're working with this species called Arabidopsis. And some of the research has shown, well, in fact, Arabidopsis has the ability to express memory, to repress memory, to recognize kin, to uh, communicate through various sensory modalities, uh, qualities that we tend to associate with intelligence or with sentience, right? So if that's the case, that a plant like Arabidopsis or a house plant or an agricultural plant that's been genetically modified, like corn or whatever it may be, if that plant is sentient, then what are the ethical implications of using it in a experimental laboratory situation, of growing it in a monocultural context where its genetic diversity is seriously imperiled. And yeah, so sentience and intelligence as possibilities raise questions about ethics. And I think that whereas certain, when we talk about animals, they become muddied or somewhat opaque when we look at plants, because plants really demand that we think of these concepts differently, right? So if we think, for example, of plant language, we have to shift our understanding of language. We have to theorize it differently in order to grasp the possibility of language in plants. And I would say a more important question is, what are the implications of not attributing sentience, intelligence, memory, language to plants and to fungi, to denying them that possibility? That question alone raises ethical concerns and horizons. So you mentioned ethnography, and I think issues of ethnography in plants uh, really raise ethical dimensions of various kinds. So there is an anthropologist named John Hartigan who wrote a text about corn. And in this monograph, there's a chapter on how to interview a plant. Now he's a very well established environmental anthropologist, but when it came to the question of how to interview corn and other plants, and he was in his text, he's working in a botanical garden setting, so not necessarily with corn, but with species, preserved species in that kind of institutional setting. And so he didn't know where to start. So he consulted a plant studies person named Natasha Myers, who's an anthropologist who's worked with plants and sentience and the anthropological implications of that. And he said, well, where do I begin? And she said, well, consult the work of Craig Holdrich, who works on the phenomenology of plants and interacting with plants in a sensory way. Okay, and he did that, and Craig Holdrich led to other readings and other sources. So he tried to implement a number of uh, new methods of interviewing plants in this botanical garden setting, where, obviously the interviews are not based on a question and answer format. There's a lot of phenomenological exploration, sensory engagement with the plants, a lot of listening, a lot of um, phenomenological in the sense of bracketing the presumptions that we may have about a plant in language in order to then be open to the horizon of possibility around plants as potential subjects within research, in this case, ethnographic research. And so he did all of this, and he did the anthropological thing, which is to keep field notes and reflect and recursively go back to the reflections and revise and so forth. And what he really came to is that he still doesn't know how to interview a plant. That it's just the terms of interviewing a plant shift the ideas of interviewing, of ethnography, of anthropology in itself. So that's where I'd say we are at in terms of engaging plants as subjects of research. Now, ethics, the ethics of plants is a fairly new area of academic inquiry. I think, of course, there have always been ethical um, interactions with plants, and you mentioned indigenous example. And in my own current work with the Sami people of northern Finland and northern Sweden, it's very much interacting, say, with reindeer on a seasonal basis, even to the extent where the seasons are demarcated by the activities of the reindeer. And that doesn't preclude killing reindeer for food in a kind of respectful way in which the life of the reindeer really infuses the community. Almost, yeah, just a whole different idea of what it means to interact with animals in that way, working the land. Now, plants are very, very deeply connected there. There are plants in the Sami calendar that announce the seasons, the shifts of the seasons, and of course, for reindeer to prosper, to thrive, they need certain plants, and those plants are changing over the year. The berries become available at a particular season. There's the lichen and the moss at other times, especially when there's heavy snowpack. So I think when we when we attempt to consider the ethics of plants, it's not invaluable. It's not a bad thing to refer back to indigenous traditions and also indigenous practices of the present, even though that may not be our tradition. We may not be indigenous people, but I think we can respectfully be inspired, perhaps, and informed by their ethical interactions with plants. But there's a document that's about 15 years old now. It's worth consulting, and it's the Swiss government's declaration of plant ethics, that plants deserve an ethical standing. And to some extent, the Constitution of Switzerland attempts to integrate ethical an ethical position on plant life when it comes to research, when it comes to other sort of urban infrastructure questions and conservation and so forth. And that document has been really important. I can make it available to anyone who's interested. And that document is really foundational in the area of plant ethics, which is really burgeoning within environmental ethics. So the short response to your question is, if the plant turn is happening, right, we're sort of at the bend, maybe at the early part of the bend. We're still not sure how plant life and this new emphasis on plant life in Western academic context and broader societal context is impacting our view of ethics and our view of research practices like ethnography. But what I can say is that because plants demand respect for their alterity, for their otherness, it's an otherness that is also strangely familiar, right? It's both other and deeply intimate and deeply familiar because we have this evolutionary relationship to plants that is completely unique. It's completely different to the human-animal relationship, and it's one that even scientists have started to refer to as when it's denied as a condition of plant kinship blindness, that we're naturally blind or we refuse to, we being Western societies, refuse to acknowledge deep evolutionary kinship between humans. To say that even most people I think would say, oh, plants and humans, no, surely it's plants and animals, right? But yes, plants and humans have a very deep evolutionary bond. So those would be some of my first hits in terms of ethics and research, especially ethnographic research. The other question we might think about, which raises its shocking or perhaps horrifying head, is that of anthropomorphism, right? If we attribute language to plants and intelligence to plants, are we merely anthropomorphizing them? The tremendous Bengali researcher J.C. Bose believed that plants have a script, that plants have a language. He devised a whole spectrum of instruments to measure the language of plants, the sensitivities of plants, and he used terms that we might say are anthropomorphizing, but that communicate that kindredness, right? that sense of evolutionary kinship. So I think there's a time for what we might think of anthropomorphization, and some scholars are working in new interpretations of anthropomorphization, critical anthropomorphizing, generative anthropomorphizing. There's other terms where careful anthropomorphizing, right, where this term needn't be a negative thing. It shows that deep, signifies that deep evolutionary interconnection with plants. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. And this is again wonderfully reflected. And I just felt when I was listening to you talking about the question of memories, the question of anthropomorphisms, the question of, and most importantly, what really fascinated is the example of the interview with plants, right? And I again, it's a very personal takeaway, and everybody might disagree with me, but I think this whole experience of trying to interview plants, but not really still being able to figure out an ideal way or a set of ideal ways of how to start interviewing plants, for me is something which is very encouraging and positive, because usually as humans, we have this by default attitude and approach that we can decode everything in this world. We have the capability of decoding, we have the capability of interpreting every knowledge system in this world. And this incapability is, in a way, sort of questioning the very anthropocentric egoisms that we humans generally live with. And I think this is becoming more and more questionable in a time where every corner of the world is so deeply impacted by a wide array of climate catastrophes and pollutions. And then, when we have these other forms of catastrophes like warfare and ethnic revolts and climate conflicts, and on the same way, we see that these issues are vastly aggravating. And in that sort of circumstance, I think plant turn is such a um, is such a powerful theory, is such a powerful methodology, and most importantly, is such a powerful way of life. Now, with regards to this way of life, I know you have already touched about that when you introduced it in the first question, and you also talked about the methods and theories in the second question. But now I'm thinking slightly in terms of as an academic discipline. Now, usually, as on the one side, as I already confessed, that I'm someone who is so much emotionally, intellectually involved in aspects related to plants and animals and more than human living forms. But on the other side, I'm always very skeptical when a particular phenomenon or a set of knowledge systems entered the arena of discipline. Although we all know that we come from academic spaces, we are all disciplined in that academic space, and no matter how much resistant and radical we are, somewhere, somewhat, we do have to practically conform to the spaces. But still, I would like to know from such an experienced and a diverse scholar like you, that and because we are all very young scholars who are just venturing into the spaces, that how do we ensure, again, it may not have like a very fixed set of answers, but still some ideas, how do we ensure that when we're engaging with a field like human plant studies in particular, or generally the whole practice of the plant turn, we make sure that apart from theorizing, which is essential, apart from conducting our research, which is obviously essential, we also have solid takeaways to contribute towards at the practical level of the society, and not repeat the same mistakes of many of the previous disciplines who have shown so much of promise in the theoretical and the methodological front, but when it comes into praxis, it hardly makes a difference. So how do we avoid that? If you can share some thoughts about that.
Uh, yes, I appreciate the question because it's something that I think about a lot. Eco-criticism evolved as an activist literary critical practice. And to what extent it's remained activist, who knows, right? Does that mean that scholars are engaged in environmental protection? Does it mean that scholars are involved in um, promoting environmental values at a community level? So yeah, it's a danger that the field becomes overly theorized, overly institutionalized. It's important that it preserves its passion for the plant, passion for the botanical world, which is a passion for life, or for vital being, for living a vibrant existence, right? And plants are incredibly great teachers when it comes to showing us what a good life is, right? It can be complicated. And so I think there are huge possibilities for the plant, let's call it human plant studies or critical plant studies, whichever term, for the really engage with that social transformation imperative, right? So how to then? Well, the first area would be plant pedagogies, right? So how if there's this phenomenon of plant blindness, or it's also called plant awareness disparity, that we as humans generally tend to disregard plants. We think, oh, that's nice, but then we forget about it. It's flowering, but then we forget about it. We don't water it. We walk past it. It's part of the scenery. That's the general idea with plant awareness disparity. Whereas an animal, in its kind of mobility that approximates our own, we tend to perceptually engage with that. But if it's a case that we naturally tend to ignore plants, well, plant pedagogies become critically urgent. How do we counter plant blindness? How do we instill or inculcate a sense of just awe around plant life? What plant life does, right? So, as a kind of deep generosity, a deep giving to us as humans, enabling our lives to thrive in so many ways, and for us to learn so many things, both hard lessons and also lessons of great um, just pleasure and a great sense of comfort that plants also impart to us. Right. So plant pedagogies. This could include uh, inviting students to observe a plant over a certain amount of time, to carefully observe the transformation of the plant over a season, let's say. Not needing to be a botanist or another kind of scientist or an ecologist, but just as someone observing, right? Draw it. This is the phenomenological approach. You observe, you draw, you write, you observe, you draw, you write over time. And what you gain is a kind of temporal appreciation for the plant. So that's one kind of approach. In my own work in Australia, I try to engage the community through poetry of plants, right? Because plants are naturally poetic subjects because we can engage our senses in understanding and appreciating them. We can see them closely. The bird, in contrast, will typically fly away. The animal will bolt. But the plant we can observe because it's relatively stationary. It's highly mobile, but relatively stationary to the human. We can touch the plant. We can taste it and eat it in certain cases. We can listen to the plant. We can listen to its environment. We can gain a kind of deep empathetic relationship to a plant. And so that's a great basis for something like poetry, which is all about transformation, which is all about uh, appreciating how life is a kind of wondrous emerging process before us that is where one moment is never the same. And so it takes us into that temporal landscape of the plant, which is deep evolutionary time. So some plant pedagogies, and that's an area of human plant studies that's being developed by scholars like Dawn Sanders and a number of others. I would say critically urgent, and it also raises some connections to environmental education, environmental pedagogies more broadly. So that's one thing. But well, even in our recent conference in Nepal, we had 2 days, in fact, 3 days of wow, just an array of rich concepts and research you wouldn't believe. So interesting and so plant centric. But how about, as Gautam uh, reminded us at the end of the conference, how about we all plant a tree, right? If we can get 300 or however many people were in attendance, 200 plus our online audience, right? That's a good population. We can plant seeds for the future, right? A tree that will outlive our own life. So I think that there are there are ways to bring the plant humanities or human plant studies or critical plant studies into the community through various media like poetry, like pedagogies, like uh, oh, so many other through art, for example, as well. And I'll just mention a project that I'm currently engaged with, which is called Gifts from the Sentient Forest in northern Finland. And so we have artists coming together, we have performers and writers and every sort of genre, right? Like videography, film, experimental film, painting, photography, poetry, and research as well, digital humanities type research. So we put them all together and said, let's focus for 2 years on the concept of forest sentience, like a deep dive into forest sentience, but let's think about it in relation to a place. And we selected northern Finland. Northern Finland has this kind of image in Europe as the last wilderness, as the last, in addition to Russia, of course. But if we're thinking of Western Europe, it's really one of the remaining wilderness areas. But in fact, it's heavily logged. It's only has 10% of only 10% of the forests are considered old growth. It's an industrial landscape. So, what does the concept of forest sentience bring to our interactions with a place that's heavily degraded, in fact? And so that's the kind of project, right? And so we have an exhibition, we engage the community, people can come, and maybe they don't even need to think about, the audience doesn't need to think about sentience in its theoretical dimensions, but they can appreciate art that's been molded and sculpted by sentience of the plants in the forest of that region of Finland. So I think these are some of the practice, not all, but not exhaustive by any means. And I think it's a really, really important part of human plant studies that I hope other researchers will undertake and advance in their own places. Ultimately, it comes back to me to place-based learning, place-based pedagogies. Yeah.
This is absolutely amazing, Prof. Especially the instances with respect to your engagements that you shared in terms of place-based knowledge systems, place-based embodied pedagogies is such an essential part because, and as you rightly mentioned, because this is also a concern that I always have that when we tell that we care for plants, we care for animals, but at the end of the day, when we see that they only end up being decorative objects in the balcony or in a private fancy garden in a house, then it only gives us more disappointment and less happiness. And I think your instances of not also enables us to understand to a vast extent of how to avoid that trap, of not falling into that trap, where we often do consciously, but on a lot of occasions we do that unconsciously. Obviously, this is such a fascinating topic, and I'm sure we can continue forever. But I just want to be a less selfish because it's an Adda where we should all also have the space to speak up. So now I really invite all of us to share your questions. Feel free to, if you want to unmute and speak, feel free to raise your hands, unmute and speak, or if you wish to put your questions in the chat box, you are more than welcome to do that. Please feel free, share your questions, share your thoughts, and I think it would be fantastic. I mean, I know that it's something we need to do a lot of self-contemplation as well. This is not something we can immediately. So while we all self-contemplate and we think and we sink in with our perspectives and thoughts, maybe I can have just if I can have a brief question for you, Prof. Um, and again, it's a question about, okay, I will stop here right away because I see that Arti has a question. Please share your thoughts on the phenomenology of plants.
Mhm. Yes, great. Well, when I think of phenomenology of plants, of course, I think of Goethe, and I think of his travels uh, as a young man in plants and developing scientific history of plants. Goethe is really a transdisciplinarian for all ages. He's, in addition to maybe Henry David Thoreau and Rachel Carson, and certainly Sir J.C. Bose. And yeah, he's the original transdisciplinarian, right? So, um, and the way that Goethe devised scientific concepts from his direct experiences of plants, and like plant morphology, the science of plant morphology really came out of Goethe's poetic and phenomenological explorations. To me, that's amazing kind of transdisciplinary work. So yes, my first association is with Goethe's work. Very important to read if you haven't had a chance yet. I highly recommend it. In fact, you can download some of beautifully recently illustrated books. For example, so many through archive.org, right? Just free downloads of some of Goethe's plant work. Um, so I think that the plant is a natural subject, and because the plant can teach us what phenomenology is, and I think that phenomenology is a marvelous framework for the plant humanities, for human plant studies, because what it teaches us is to hone our sensory interaction with plants. I think perceptually, at least in my own life, there's this tendency to kind of notice a plant and shift away. Notice something about a plant, like a fruit, a flower, and then shift away to something else, right? It's this uh, maybe scattered mode of perception. What phenomenology of plants teaches us is to still our attention, still our attention, bracket the preconceptions that we have about the plant, and also to calm that urge we may have to know the plant's name, to know something about this is incredible, right? When I see oftentimes, including myself, what's the name of the plant, right? And someone will ask me, well, what's the name? I say, I don't know. You can make one up. That might be fun too. But we are really, in our interaction with plants, it's often guided by a scientific naming, which is a Linnaean tradition, right? The species, the genus and the species, the binomial name. That reflects how ingrained the Linnaean tradition is in us in our interactions with plants. So what the phenomenology of plants teaches us is to let that go. Don't worry about the name. Don't worry about that prior knowledge of the plant. Don't feel like you need to classify it as a rose, as an orchid, as this or that. Just let the plant become or be before your perception, and then you might um, change your perspective on the plant. If you're working with a tree phenomenologically, you might walk around the tree, then you might move your attention from the bottom of the tree to the top, and then from the top to the bottom. And as you're doing this, you're oftentimes drawing, you're oftentimes writing and reflecting, and also bracketing as those thoughts come up. So it's almost like a meditative process. As that thought flies into your mind, what is the name? What's the genus of that plant? You just let it go. Not that that information is not valuable, but phenomenology provides this almost pure mode, what they call exact sensorial imagination, right? So you might say, well, isn't that overly subjective? Or if we're trying to get away from anthropocentrism, isn't that a very highly individuated, and doesn't that in fact just return us to the anthropocentric state we're trying to overcome? No, because I think relationality is essential to our interaction with plants, but it has to be in fact relationality, give and take, right? Because the plant gives us a lot, and in conferring our attention to the plant in this focused way, we're giving. I think that plants long for relation. That may seem very romantic to say, but there's some I think evolutionary truth to that. Much as we might long for relation, we might love a tree, we might love an orchid, we might love a forest, right? I think that forest also has a desire for relation. And if you look at many indigenous traditions, they will say the plant needs relation as much as we need relation with the planet. Okay, so that's phenomenology of plants in a nutshell, at least as I see it. And the work of Craig Holdrich has been very important to the recent development of phenomenology of plants. I recommend consulting some of his work. He's been doing phenomenology of plants for multiple decades, so it's a great resource. And his work will take you through systematically on how to engage with the plant phenomenologically. So if you're doing plant research, even in a literary context, but certainly, let's say in an anthropological, sociological, even historical context, disciplinary context, you can use plant phenomenological methods. You could engage with a plant phenomenologically and then read a text about it, read a poem by Wordsworth that was dedicated to the plant, or a poem by Tagore or whoever it may be. So, yeah, those are some of the strengths of phenomenology as I see them.
Great. Thank you so much, Prof. We have another question from Tanmoy Sarkar. Tanmoy asks, my question is, first of all, thank you so much for this insightful green Adda. My question is in the South Asian context. How is plant humanities study different from the global Western narratives? How does the indigenous dialogue or tenets of eco-spirituality and the maldevelopmental conditions affect the arboreal approach?
Mhm. This is a very timely question, and some of our participants are also contributed to the conference that we just had in Nepal, which really focused on this. What does the plant humanities mean in the South Asian context, where there are these deep traditions of human interactions with plants, often on spiritual terms as well? If we think of a plant like Tulsi, right, that's a part of the everyday life of most South Asian, especially people in India. Um, this is a great example of a plant that's part of the fabric of society, and also is considered a sacred plant. So that's an example of the deep kind of tradition of plant humanities that exists in India and other parts of South Asia, and really the work of plant humanists in South Asia. It's to call attention to those traditions, to give them prominence, right? When Tagore writes about plants, um, it means so many things, right? It means beauty, yes, but also deep sense of spirituality and an empathetic identification, and also the power of the plant to inspire language. And so that's what I mean by a plant talking back to a work, right? If we're a creative writer and we're writing a poem about a plant, the plant is talking back, it's contributing to that work through the way that it might smell, to the way that it might interrupt the work, by challenging our very limited human language. So I think art, and especially writing, that's the area that I can speak uh, most confidently about, are naturally collaborative when it comes to plants in particular, or intrinsically collaborative processes. So some of the challenges I would say in the South Asian context is being aware of the global North, global South disparities that have already occurred in the field of plant humanities. Plant humanities really has evolved out of work at Kew Gardens, work at Dumbarton Oaks, which is connected to Harvard University, other botanical institutions of the North that have these problematic legacies of interactions with plants, but also the communities, indigenous and local and other communities connected to those plants, And that's, a place like Kew Gardens is remarkable, in terms of the collection of global plants and the research that's been done over hundreds of years. But there is the colonial legacy of a place like Kew Gardens that needs to be critiqued and needs to be addressed. So I would say that's something to consider for a plant humanities of South Asia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, certainly in Australia also, and elsewhere, South America, when we're looking at indigenous people and plants. And so, yes. And the other point I'll just mention briefly is the question of how valuable is it to import certain theories and methodologies of the plant humanities into research, either on South Asian plants or South Asian artists or researchers or authors who have engaged with plants. It's just a question to bear in mind. I mean, the work, for example, of Michael Marder is very influential, but it's important to bear in mind that it comes from a certain philosophical tradition, and there are certain assumptions at work within those theorizations of plants, and that there are certain limitations that are imposed that within those theorizations of plants that may not be viable in if applied to looking at a plant thinker of South Asia or a plant species of South Asia or a plant philosophy of South Asia. And yeah, so those would be some of my rough thoughts at the moment, not fully formed, and it's an ongoing dialogue for sure.
No, great,
Oh,
bro.
and just,
Yeah, sorry.
oh, I'm sorry, just to mention the question of eco-spirituality. Yeah, that's one of the real areas of South Asian plant humanities I hope is developed in coming years. And there were a number of presentations at the conference on sacred groves, for example, and how that connection between conservation, heritage, spirituality is so palpable. And these are excellent subjects for plant humanities research in India and South Asia broadly.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Prof. I think we are actually, obviously, we do have a lot of so many perspectives, I'm sure. But I would like to take this one question. I'm trying to, yes, trying to find out. Yes, Shubhodeep has a question. I think we unfortunately have to wrap up, but I'm sure this is one of the beginning of many other conversations in the future. Shubhodeep asked that how can we really think with the plants when invasive species are concerned? And Shubhadeep also asks that the narrative seems challenging and contradictory at times. That do you think that contradictions signify the ways of vegetal thinking? And what's your take on that?
Okay, yeah. Um, weed plants, invasives. There's so many terms for them: naturalized, exotic, aggressive, invasive. Uh, the the diversity of the lexicon says a lot in itself about our conflicted relationship with weed plants. Um, the reality is that weed plants are incredibly resilient, adaptive, and even intelligent. It's been shown that some weed plants have an exceptional ability for memory, and that memory has helped them to travel the globe. You think of a plant like nettle or, oh gosh, dandelion, chickweed. These are plants that have figured out how to be global citizens, whether we like it or not. And also that weed plants complicate our um, expectations, and they demand us to think that we think differently about the world around us. Now, there are the obvious ecological implications of certain weeds. That's undeniable, right? There are certain wetland weeds that will just consume the wetland and produce anaerobic conditions that then drown out the other more sensitive wetland species. That's irrefutable. But I think that there's a lot we can learn from weed plants in the plant humanities. I would encourage people to adopt a weed as a subject of research. And how have writers written about that so-called weed? How have artists depicted it? What do scientists say about it? What do ecologists say about it? How can we think about that weed differently? What's the wisdom of the weed? Because weeds are our sojourners, right? They accompany us in this life in its globalized world, and so that's interesting in itself. I would say there's an area of the plant humanities that could focus more on weed plants, and that would really be productive and generative work. The contradictions, uh, I'm not so sure. I mean, it may depend on how you see certain contradictions arising within the plant humanities discourse, but there is a kind of mm, alterity at work within plant life where it might be read as contradiction, and when we speak of it, we might be read as being contradictory. But I think that plants demand that we think both subject and object together, that we think both nature and culture together, and maybe that kind of dialectic or dialogic nature could be read as contradictory. Mm, yeah, I mean, is it contradictory to eat plants but also regard them as ethical subjects? It's a question. I don't think so. We need to eat plants. But in eating plants, they are taken into our bodies. They also regenerate through our eating of them. They are spread through our eating of them. Plants crave relationship. Plants crave relationship, just like we crave relationship with plants and other beings. And so eating is a kind of relationship that can be done respectfully and ethically. So yeah, there are many, many other contradictions, I'm sure, but those contradictions certainly help us think through some of what's happening in the field at the moment, which is great. There's a lot happening in the field, much of which is unresolved, much of which needs much more work from young scholars, from whoever is interested to contribute.
Great. And I think in continuation to what you said, Prof, and the questions that have already been asked, I think at certain points of time, it is so essential that instead of trying to, again, a very usual human tendency, I always see that always trying to find a point of convergence, it is at times essential to appreciate, moments and experiences of divergence, especially when we are interacting with the more than human communities like plants and animals and different other more than human forms, because that is also, I believe, an essential part of our pedagogical process, an essential part of our theorizing process. I'm sure we would be having endless number of questions, but very unfortunately, we just have to bring a halt to our conversation. But I don't want to say we are concluding, because honestly, we are not concluding. We are just, opening up spaces for many further such conversations in the near and far future. But I deeply appreciate Professor John for being there, for your fantastic reflections and being so patient. And we all understand that, and which you also have rightly mentioned several number of times during our reflections, that this is not a perspective, this is not a phenomenon like many other problematic disciplines where we are trying to pin down to a set of conclusions. But it is about exploring, evolving, experiencing, not being able to understand certain things, being able to understand certain things, and just embrace that process in the way of understanding and interpretation. Thank you once again, and also a warm thanks to all of you who were present here with your wonderful questions, with your wonderful reflections. Even if you have not asked any question, your presence, listening to us and thinking with us means a lot to all of us. So thanks a lot. Stay well, and we will talk very soon.